Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Made by McGill alumni webcast, Voices from the Past, How Lesser-Known Histories Can Help Us Navigate Today. My name is Derek Kassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Thursday, November 19th. There is no doubt that the world today is consumed by events that have the power to shape our planet and our societies right before our very eyes. From the COVID-19 pandemic and the struggles for social justice to the desperate fight against climate change, it sometimes feels as if we're all participants in one giant history lesson. For many, this unprecedented confluence of life altering events underscores the important role that history and historical research play in helping us better understand our world. It also reminds us how much we rely on informed public debate through history research and writing, which is what motivated the late Peter Cundill to found the Cundill History Prize here at McGill, his alma mater, over a decade ago. 2 weeks from today, the winner of the 2020 Cundill History Prize will be announced, and we will learn which of this year's exceptional history books has been judged to best embody historical scholarship, originality, literary quality, and broad appeal, and which historian will walk away with the $75,000 US prize, the largest and most prestigious of its kind. But today, we have the enormous pleasure of discussing the three finalists with a panel of eminent McGill professors, representing three distinct areas of scholarship within our Faculty of Arts. So let me introduce them now. First, we have Professor William Adjetey, who is an assistant professor in McGill's Department of History and Classical Studies, who specializes in the African American experience in the post-Reconstruction United States, as well as the African diaspora in Canada and the Caribbean Basin. Welcome, Professor Adjetey. We also have with us Professor Sandeep Banerjee, who's an associate professor in the Department of English and a specialist in post-colonial literature with an emphasis on the British Empire. Welcome to you, Professor Banerjee. And finally, Professor Lisa Overholzer, assistant professor and William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Anthropology, whose research examines the everyday lives of ordinary people living in central Mexico during ancient and colonial times. So welcome to all three of you, and thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us today. Before we jump into the conversation, a reminder that if you are watching live and have questions for our professors, you can send them to us by email to aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our panel. So unlike many of our past alumni webcasts, we gave today's professors some homework, which was to read one of the three Cundill Prize finalist books and share with us some of their initial thoughts. But to be fair, the books were assigned based on how closely the themes aligned with their own areas of research and expertise. And we'll begin today's conversation by asking each professor to speak about their assigned book and explain why this research is so important and so deserving of Cundill consideration. So with that, let's start with Professor Adjetey and his review of Tacky's Revolt, the story of an Atlantic slave war, written by Vincent Brown, a professor of history and professor of African and African American studies at Harvard University. Professor Adjetey, how was your reading experience? What is the book's contribution to how we understand the Atlantic slave trade? And are there any historical misconceptions that Professor Brown tries to dismantle in his work?
Thank you, Derek. It's my absolute pleasure to be on this panel today. It was an even greater pleasure to have read Professor Brown's book, Tacky's Revolt. And Professor Brown is a meticulous historian, one of the finest in our profession. And the beauty of this book and the sheer sort of brilliance of this book is that Professor Brown describes it as a war within wars. And let me explain what that means. So in essence, there are four concurrent or overlapping or imbricating wars in the Atlantic world that Tacky's Revolt chronicles, that the historian Vince Brown chronicles. The first is certainly the rise of these territorially expansive, militaristic empires on the West African coast, on the Guinea coast, and how these wars of expansion and aggression in many ways and resistance spill over into the Caribbean basin and throughout the Americas. That's the first part. The second aspect is what Vince Brown describes as the race war of sorts between enslaved Africans who have rallied around various identities in the Americas and the Caribbean Basin, and certainly their enslavers and the white colonial administrators, the militias, et cetera, et cetera. The third aspect of this war within wars is what Brown describes as the internal strife and internal factions among various African peoples. And in many ways, the transplanting of old world beefs and alliances, which are playing out in these very complex plantation societies, right, in the Caribbean Basin, in particular in Jamaica. And certainly the last war within these overlapping and concurrent wars is the 7 Years' War. And I think this is where the book's main and principal intervention is present in terms of how past historians, in many ways, military historians, but also historians of enslaved Africans and the experiences of the plantation economies in the Americas have neglected to bring these two different events and phenomena into conversation. And so one of the main misconceptions certainly is to understand that the various conflicts that we see with the rise of the Atlantic world, right, with the various European powers, the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, Brandenburgers, the Spanish, the Portuguese, et cetera, who are deriving, and extracting massive wealth from sugar and indigo and cotton, et cetera, which is effectively lubricating the gears of empire. And certainly the individuals, the Africans themselves, which are in many ways supporting and expanding these various European empires, are inextricably linked to various imperial rivalries. And certainly we see this playing out on sort of multiple levels, on multiple theaters. And I think this is certainly one of the ways that we can understand that enslavement was not certainly isolated from major military events. And certainly something like the 7 Years' War, which historians have written about extensively, hasn't really been conceptualized as a major boundary shifting event that also had implications in terms of how African peoples imagined boundaries themselves and imagined new terrain in the Americas. And lastly, if I may just add that one of the joys of reading Tacky's Revolt, in fact, is because it actually hit close to home. And I haven't read a book since I can't remember any time, sort of by a professional historian that really hit so close to home. And the reason why I say that is because my peoples and my ancestors come from that part of the world on the Guinea coast. And in fact, the direct sort of place from which my ancestors have dwelled for 500 years before sort of the rise of this transatlantic slave trade and these imperial rivalries in our language is called the belly of the beast. And this is part of sort of the sacred knowledge that they had, that they knew death as such an intimate experience and that they dwelled within sort of the contours and the parameters of death. And so any enemy combatants or rival societies or empires would have to know death as intimately as they do before they could be subdued as enslaved peoples. And so reading this work in many ways sheds light on just the complexities of the time. And it was a sure pleasure indeed.
Great. I have so many potential follow-up questions to ask you about that. And I think we'll hopefully have a chance to address some of the themes that you touched on, including this notion of telling history through the perspective of the oppressed and the colonized. But before we get in more into the book, I do want to move on to our next book. So let me turn over now to Professor Overholzer. So you read Fifth Son, A New History of the Aztecs, written by Camilla Townsend, Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University in New Jersey. A book that I found particularly fascinating since it shed a light on a civilization and a people that I knew very little about. So as an anthropologist whose research is focused on Mexican populations, you must have picked up on some things that an unfamiliar reader would not have. So what was the reading experience like for you as an anthropology professor with expertise in that world? And what has Professor Townsend pulled off by exploring the life of the Aztecs in the way that she has?
Yeah, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today talking about these three fantastic books. As you say, I come at this book from the perspective of an anthropological archaeologist. And What strikes me about the reading experience of Camilla Townsend's Fifth Son is that it's actually quite anthropological, in that we commonly say that the task of the anthropologist is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. By immersing ourselves in another culture, which is what Townsend does by going directly to the writings of Indigenous peoples in their native language of Nahuatl, we can begin to understand practices and beliefs that are quite distant from our own. We can also simultaneously become more cognizant of our own assumptions and the things that we take for granted. The Aztecs are in many ways the sort of archetypal other, and that's in part precisely because much of what we know about them has been filtered through the lens of the European colonizers who wrote the vast majority of the history. Townsend remarkably makes this other familiar in a couple of key ways that I want to highlight. First, as I mentioned, by going directly to the words of the indigenous and mestizo descendants of the Aztecs who were writing in the early colonial period. And then secondly, through the storytelling and a narrative structure that she employs that I think actually would have been appreciated by the post-classic Central Mexicans who were master storytellers themselves. So narrative, and especially fictional narrative, has been a feminist academic mainstay for several decades now. It generally represents the rejection of a very objective and distanced and passive voice that's so typical of academia. And instead, feminist scholars embrace a more peopled, social, and emotional sort of perspective. And Townsend does this beautifully. But what's really exceptional to me in this book is the prose that she uses. It's absolutely beautifully written. She occasionally walks us through the process of making sense of these texts, this sort of internal logic. So to highlight one passage, she writes, in 1426, the king of the powerful town called Azcapotzalco, who was named Tezozomoc, who had ruled since 1370, died in his bed. The Tepanec leader had personified power in the valley for so many years that when he died, people looked uncertainly at each other. Suddenly, the old king's sons lunged forward into action, but they did not move to defend their family's turf as one might expect. Instead, they turned on each other with murderous intent. Now, Townsend explains that this might seem puzzling at first, but when we take into account the pre-Hispanic practice of polygamy, which would have created so many different potential claimants to the throne, it makes a lot of sense. Each of her chapters begin with narratives about a single individual, single historical person. So, for example, Itzcoatl, who is the Aztec ruler, the first after the formation of the Aztec Triple Alliance, who burned existing codices in order to rewrite Aztec imperial histories. Or Don Martin, who's the son of Cortez and his translator Malinche. These individuals weave through the chapter and sort of serve to structure it. And it's one of the ways that we get this really intensely personal view. So I'll highlight one brief passage from Don Martin's narrative. It's about him visiting his half-sister Maria, who he hadn't seen in many years because he'd been in Spain for some years prior. Quote, the young woman he had seen in 1540 had turned into an exhausted, middle-aged woman, weakened and demoralized by countless pregnancies that had yielded only 2 living children. So we see that the writing is so personal. It so vividly brings us into the political world of the Aztecs. It allows us to see their histories from their own Aztec imperial perspective. And you can even start to empathize with these individuals, right, who we don't normally empathize with the Aztecs. And this is, another thing that I want to emphasize is that her book spans the Spanish conquest. And scholars from a number of disciplines, including history and archaeology, have recently begun to reconstruct longer-term histories of indigenous peoples. The idea is that their defeat and conquest should be included, but they should not be defined by it. The people's lives should not be defined by that. We shouldn't treat the arrival of European colonizers as the defining moment of indigenous lives throughout the Americas. And Townsend emphasizes that actually by creating this longer term history, and in particular by going back in time before the arrival of the Spanish, that we actually get a better understanding of the colonial period itself. So by understanding the complexity of internal politics that existed in the Aztec period and even in the pre-Aztec period, we see the social unrest of the 1560s as actually entirely predictable. It makes sense, right? Similarly, Marina or Malinche, who translated for Cortez, shouldn't be seen as a traitor to her people, because in fact, the Mexica who ruled the Aztec imperial capital were, in the pre-Hispanic period, her enemies. So without the internal political divisions that were so characteristic of the post-classic period, and that produced these willing indigenous allies who later self-identified as indigenous conquerors, the Spanish never would have been able to defeat the Aztecs, in fact. So this long-term perspective gives us a fuller, richer, more nuanced, and actually, better understanding of the past, and it creates a narrative that does justice to the lives of indigenous conquered peoples.
Great, thank you. And I particularly appreciated the last chapter in the book where she focuses on the grandchildren, or that generation of grandchildren of those who had been conquered, and you see how the civilization is changing as it's being sort of absorbed or assimilated into the sort of Spanish, what we now, I guess, we call Mexican culture that sort of taking over in the cities in particular, and how that impacts their view on society, their memories. Very, very interesting. Both books, I will say, were quite fascinating to read. So let me turn over to Professor Banerjee now. So the book that we assigned to you was The Anarchy: The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, written by William Dalrymple, a much decorated Scottish historian and writer. So I have to admit that this is the one of the three books that I did not have a chance to dive into yet, though I'm in the queue waiting to borrow my digital copy from the McGill Library. So Professor Banerjee, can you tell us about this book, what span of history it covers, and why it has been so highly regarded in literary circles and among the Cundill Prize jurors?
So I think I want to start by saying a few things about South Asian imperial history, which is that you can divide it broadly into two parts. The first 100-odd years, 1757 to 1857, is essentially the rule of South Asia, what we now understand as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, all these nation states, this region. It was a rule by the British East India Company, which after the 1857 uprising comes under the British Crown, and it becomes a colony in the traditional sense of the term. So the first 100 years is a story of not just colonialism, but also a kind of corporatist colonialism. So it's a very interesting origin story, if you will, of a company essentially setting up shop in a distant land and setting up what eventually would be a very fundamental space and a very, very significant space for British imperialism. So of this 1757 to 1857, this period, Dalrymple's book focuses on the first bit of it, as he himself writes, 1757 to 1803. That's what it focuses on the rise of the East India Company and how the East India Company sort of, as I said, sets up shop. And I use sets up shop both in an idiomatic manner, but quite literally setting up shop. And what you get from Dalrymple is a kind of, and this is something that he's known for, narrative history in that kind of traditional racy, page-turning kind of way. It is obviously well researched, but nevertheless, it's also wonderful to read. And the name itself is also quite interesting, as you just mentioned, anarchy. And this goes to the heart of what is usually understood, particularly by sort of imperial historians, like the colonialism is kind of rule of good governance, a rule of law, etc. So Dalrymple here, and I'm just going to quote this from this writer, Fakir Khair bin Ilabadi, as he puts it: disorder and corruption no longer sought to hide themselves, and the once peaceful realm of India became the abode of anarchy. And this is a very different, if you will, a kind of a revisionist understanding of the origins of British imperialism in South Asia, where you see the British imperial project spearheaded through the East India Company, not as the establishment of the rule of law, but rather as a kind of inauguration of an anarchic mode of governance. Essentially, by that we're thinking here of plunder and so on and so forth. Now, and not just plunder, it also leads, for instance, by 1770 to a massive famine in the province of Bengal, where 10 million people, that's 1/3 of the population, is killed, and famines just stay on in South Asia. It's completely intimately linked to the history of British colonialism in South Asia, not just during the East India Company rule, but also all the way to the direct rule of the British state, all the way to 1945, when another 3 million people of Bengal were killed. So it really does unleash a certain structure of history, if you will, a structure of governance that stays for the entire 190 odd years of British rule in India. And so to kind of focus on the first 50 odd years to show how this kind of corporatist plunder is absolutely structural and fundamental to British rule in India is, I think, very illuminating. It is a wonderful read. And and as the book itself begins, it starts with by pointing out how the Urdu Hindi word for plunder, loot, comes into the English language because of the rule of the British East India Company. So it really, in a sense, is revisionist in the most basic way of a certain understanding of the origin story of colonialism in South Asia.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you, for those wonderful, short but very thorough reviews. I guess if I were to ask the question, which of these books should win the Cundill Prize, I'm afraid I might get 3 answers, so I won't go there yet. Just a reminder before we continue on that if anyone is watching live and does have any questions for our, any or all of our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. We did receive one already just as we were going live, which I can get to, but I think it sort of talks to the next thing which I wanted to talk about, which is the common theme or themes that are tying all these books together. So as I read through and about these books and have listened to each of you speak to them, it occurs to me that they all sort of, they all focus on writers who are attempting to examine historical events through the voices of the oppressed, which is an approach that is not always followed in the recording and writing of history. So I guess my question to the panelists would be, I'll keep it very broad to start, but who gets to make history? Who should decide what goes on the record and what does not? And what have these 3 authors contributed to the conversations by specifically shining a light on the oppressed? Maybe I'll turn back to you, Professor Adjetey. You were talking quite a bit about this in your review of Tacky's Revolt. So why is it so important and so rare, I guess, to come across this approach?
I guess I might start my response with another historian's really important intervention in the field, and that's Ed Baptist at Cornell, who wrote a book on the emergence of American capitalism called The Half Has Never Been Told, right? And some might attribute that to a very famous Bob Marley song, 3 decades before, Half That Story Has Never Been Told, in terms of understanding the experiences of enslaved Africans and their descendants in the Atlantic world. But this is, again, one of the interventions that Vince Brown makes in terms of approaching a subject that historians have known about for over 300 or close to 300 years, but have not made the connections in terms of how this particular, to use a Jeffersonian parlance, servile insurrection was part and parcel of the 7 Years' War, which remaps the world order as we know it, right, between British and French, and to a lesser extent, maybe Spanish, Prussia, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fact that a historian like Vince Brown is able to connect these dots, first and foremost, signals something to me as a young historian coming up. that we need a plurality of voices. We need a plurality of experience, of talent within this pool that we call history and sort of professional history. And still to this point, I mean, my discipline is quite elite. And historically, individuals who came from very elite backgrounds had that privilege, access to formal education, access to training, access to archives, access to various languages to chronicle the past. And we see just the beauty of the world opening up. Again, in the spirit of Bob Marley, half that story has never been told. What happens when historians who are coming from a very different background, right? And to me, this is part of the nonlinear approach, even though history, more or less, we perceive it as sort of lineal. But this is sort of the nonlinear approach to understanding our profession, understanding sort of the science of historiography, that is sort of the writing of history. And in fact, privileging the voices of the most downtrodden individuals and reading against the grain, as Brown calls it, right? In terms of understanding archival material, whether it's Dutch, whether it's Danish, whether it's French, whether it's British, and also the scant materials that the Africans themselves have left behind. And lastly, Brown is an unusual historian in the sense that he is wickedly creative, and not all historians, very few historians actually come to the profession understanding visual culture and visual material. I think one of his first projects was an award-winning documentary on Herskovits, and his research and foray into sort of the African diasporic past. And so with this talent and the fact that Brown was able to create this sort of cartography, these very intricate maps of how these servile insurrections, these slave revolts were occurring at the same time that the 7 Years' War was happening as well. I mean, to me, it just says that this is why we need a plurality of voice, a plurality of experiences shaping the landscape of historiography.
Great. Very well said. Thank you. So, Professor Overholzer, in Professor Adjetey's remarks, he actually referenced scant materials being available, I guess, from the African side. So I wanted to sort of touch on that point with you, because I know that can obviously be a big constraint for historians. Access to materials from both sides obviously is not equal, and clearly this must have been a challenge for Professor Townsend when dealing with trying to explore the Aztec civilization and trying to track down historical records, many of which, even if she was able to find them, would have been written in Nahuatl. So I guess the question to you is, how difficult is it to retrieve or reconstruct these lesser known histories and marginalized perspectives? And are there any lessons that we might take away from what Professor Townsend and our other finalist authors have been able to do in reconstructing these pasts?
Yeah, absolutely. Townsend reminds us of a number of sort of history burning events, both in the pre-Hispanic and in the colonial past. So we know, for example, that in the pre-Hispanic past, during Aztec times, there were women scribes, but none of their words have survived because the Spanish burned all or nearly all documents, and in its place they implemented a system of education, legal system, and so on, these frameworks that excluded women from the process of production of history, even if we do have some sources written by men of indigenous descent. So there certainly are, limited sources. Many of them are in Nahuatl, which is taught in very few university contexts. I was fortunate myself. I did my undergrad at Berkeley and actually was able to learn classical Nahuatl, but it's, challenging to make sense of those documents. Many of those documents have in fact been translated into English, and my students actually in my Mesoamerican archaeology course read some of these, but obviously work in translation, you lose quite a bit. So she does a really remarkable job with the very limited and scarce documentary record that she has. And one thing that I want to highlight that she does that is perhaps the most novel in terms of her contribution is that she recounts some of the history of Afro-Mexican colonial residents. And the African population in Mexico is perhaps the most ignored, essentially excluded entirely from Mexican national narratives. And there aren't documents that, or many documents at all, that they authored. So, but Townsend does look to the chronicles written by indigenous and mestizo residents of Mexico City in order to get at that. So, you know, we hear that until about 1600, more Africans were brought to Mexico than anywhere else in the New World. There's a huge population in Mexico that is contributing culturally in terms of labor, you know, in all of these regards. And she brings out some of these really fascinating events. There's a mock coronation in a party on the street in Mexico City in 1608 on Christmas Eve. There's a mock coronation of a Black king and queen in this party. After that, she recounts this story about the murder of an enslaved woman by her owner in 1611, and there were protest marches in the streets after that, and then the subsequent torture and eventual hanging of 35 Black residents of Mexico City for supposedly fomenting rebellion. We hear this from the lens of this indigenous chronicler who says that he doesn't believe that they actually were plotting anything. But so you know, the archives is as full of silences and biases as they are. They can, as Professor Adjetey said, be read across the grain, right? By critically evaluating them, looking for evidence of absence in order to come to an alternative interpretation. But I must also say that, you know, as an archaeologist, I also see the limits of the historical record, right? And the silencing that happens in history, not only when the documents are written, but when they are archived and then when they are studied. You know, the stories recounted by the Black residents of Mexico City were not penned by them. And so this is where I think that complementary disciplines like archaeology are so crucial. Not everybody wrote documents, nor did people necessarily keep and archive those documents, but everybody left behind trash. We often say that the archaeological record is a more democratic source of information because it is representative and reflective of all past peoples. I excavate indigenous people's houses, for example, to look at their everyday lives. There are other scholars, and I'm thinking of Dr. Julie West, who's at North Carolina State University. She's a bioarchaeologist, and she did this fascinating study of the skeletons of indigenous and Afro-Mexican residents of early colonial Mexico City. And by looking at the musculoskeletal markers, literally the marks that are left behind on bones as people used their muscles and labored under slavery in this period, she can reconstruct the particular ways that their bodies were worked on through their work. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the material or archaeological record can also help us to fill in some of those silences that exist in the historical record.
Great. Very, thank you for that response. It's, again, very thorough, and I think it's just a good appreciation of what Professor Townsend has managed to pull off through this retelling. Professor Banerjee, maybe what I'll do is I'll maybe perhaps turn the question that has come into us to you. It came to us from Professor Chabot Basu, and his question specifically about the anarchy is, in what way does William Dalrymple's work capture the agency of the oppressed? So maybe I'll let you answer that, because I think it ties into this theme as well.
Well, the short answer is that it's actually concerned with the institutional history of the East India Company. So the agency of the oppressed is not a direct concern of this text. But what it does very well is actually give us a sense of the social matrix in which a lot of these agents, local princes, the British East India Company, and the regional leaders, and the Mughal state, which is kind of gently kind of shrinking, if you will, how they're contesting, and I think the most important achievement, if you will, of this text is to foreground, as the title says, the idea of anarchy as a key to the origin story of British Empire in India. And this speaks directly to, I think, some of the questions that you were asking about who gets to write history. And that question reminded me of this very famous line by Walter Benjamin, that every document of civilization is also at the same time a document of barbarism. And I think in some ways that really shines forth in Dan Rimpo's narrative. It's a narrative story, you just narrative history. So you just see it kind of developing. The gradual power of the East India Company developing, sort of the imperial legacies taking shape. And the other thing that I want to say, and this I think connects to both what Professor Overholzer and Professor Adjetey mentioned, but somewhat differently, because it's not simply about reading in the silences in the case of Mughal India or pre-colonial, the Indian state or the Mughal state before the British. What we have is a move from one language, a register of language to another. So from the 1830s, because of the British East India Company, you have the establishment of English in South Asia. Mm-hmm. So Mughal state is a highly documentary state. It documents everything. It has reams and reams of records. But because of a certain transformation in sort of languageability in the common man, and these languages of the language of the Mughal state is largely Persian. That's the language of the court. There's a move from 1835 from Persian to English. So what happens as a result of this transformation is that both the late colonial state and the post-colonial state in South Asia, it loses access to its own historical continuity. Mm. And so you can't quite literally read the records that precede the establishment of the colonial state. So there's a certain break in not just political tradition, but also social tradition and linguistic continuity. So you actually, you're quite unaware of the intricacies of language. And what Dalrymple does quite well with the help of translators is to actually kind of look up some of these sources, translate them, and this is something he's been doing for a while now, sort of illuminating different aspects of this this period. So I think those are very key achievements of this text.
Great. Well, thank you. And spoken very well as an English literature professor, appreciating I guess in some ways, the move to English. So let me maybe take a couple steps back from these books and sort of put this question out to all of you, and that is that here we are in the year 2020, a year where there's so much happening. There's so much societal and political decisions that are being made, and health issues as well that are bound to have significant impacts for years and perhaps even generations to come. Which got me thinking a little bit about this question, which is, why is it important for all of us, not just historians and professors among us, but why is it important for us across society to better understand and reflect upon humanity's past deeds and misdeeds? And how can more distant histories contribute to our understanding of what's happening in the world today? Maybe I'll start with the historian on our panel, Professor Adjetey, if you want to take a first crack at that.
Sure. Derek, can you actually repeat the last part? It broke a little bit on my end.
Oh, so the last part was, how can more distant histories contribute to our understanding of the world today?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. Of course, it's not an easy question to answer. But where the peoples of African descent are concerned, and certainly Africans on the continent, you cannot begin to understand the current plight, the various forms of intractable violence, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, called the futile rebellions of African Americans. You cannot begin to grasp just how complex these issues are without sort of a longue durée understanding of where those particular societies have come from, how far they've come, and how they have evolved over the passage of time. In the context of the Caribbean, for example, certainly the context of the United States, with the anti-Black protests that we saw, or the resistance to anti-Black racism that we saw earlier this year. So much of that history is embedded in the colonial and sort of post-revolution United States. The various forms of subordination, the various forms of subjugation, the codification of racial caste, and the legacies that continue to reverberate today. Right. So much of the Black experience is pockmarked by this sort of really complex history. And also it is anchored down by this history that denies Black people the type of self-determination that various groups have achieved in North America and certainly in Africa. In the context of Tacky's revolt, in the context of Vince Brown's work, it is quite remarkable. And I think this is probably like an undercurrent throughout the book, that we are witnessing another frontier, another battlefront, right? And Brown, as I mentioned, talks about sort of 4 imbricated concurrent wars. This is a new frontier, new battle as we've entered the 21st century with this pandemic, with economic austerity, et cetera, et cetera. And to appreciate where we are and perhaps where we're headed, we have to understand our past. We have to teach history in a way that is holistic, in a way that is reflective, as certainly as accurate as possible. Otherwise, it would just be sort of empty gestures, empty sort of liberal gestures that we need a better society without understanding how we got to this particular moment.
Great, thank you. Professor Overholtzer, yeah, I was going to turn to you next, but maybe I'll frame it a little bit differently for you, if that's all right. And I know here in Canada, for instance, there's been a lot of conversation and discussion in recent years about reconciling with our Indigenous communities. And I wonder, what can we learn from the experience of the Aztecs in Mexico and elsewhere, perhaps in Central America, that we might want to bring to the discussion around how we as societies today continue to treat or perhaps reconcile with those who were on our lands before us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we are recognizing a lot now is the need for more collaborative projects. Indigenous, in my field, Indigenous archaeology, but Indigenous history, of course. A similar sort of framework. And this is important for a couple of reasons. It's important ethically in terms of trying to, from a more activist perspective, trying to undo or rectify some of those past societal wrongs. But we're also realizing that it is also urgent from an epistemological perspective. That is how we know what we know, and the quality of the data and the quality of the understandings that we come from. From feminist standpoint theory, we understand that, as scholars, we come at any question, and the very questions that we ask are all structured by our past experiences, our perspectives, and so on. And if we include people who have traditionally been excluded from the process of production of history, those people who are outsiders, essentially, to modern Western scientific epistemological frameworks, then they can help us to see and recognize the biases or the biased assumptions that we have been making in our own research. And so it opens new questions up. It opens up new interpretations, and we end up with better reconstructions of the past, right? By including these more diverse perspectives and standpoints. If I can also comment on
Yes.
the fact that this is 2020 and reading this book was fascinating precisely because, you know, Townsend talks a lot about the epidemics of the early colonial period, and we're now in this pandemic situation, right? And I sort of had to, I reading her discussion of this this woman named Lordly Daughter, Tequitpotzin, who is sweeping the literal and figurative cobwebs out of her home in the sort of disorder of the first wave of smallpox in Mexico City. And I remember noticing under lockdown, I had my 2 small children at home with me full time, and the world itself was so disordered that I was completely unable to tolerate disorder in the home, right? So I would vacuum the whole house every night. And, you know, it was like, I couldn't control the chaos outside, but I could control it on the inside. And I understood something more about the ritual role of sweeping in Aztec Central Mexico. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting that we take cleaning advice from the Aztecs, but I do think that it's worth thinking about and working to understand what happens to societies in pandemics, in what happens to cultures in chaos. How do they come out of them? How are they changed by them? We've heard a lot recently about the Spanish flu because that is a much closer, you know, temporally and culturally to us. But I think that the distant Aztecs offer insight too. And Townsend writes quite a lot about the resilience of indigenous people in colonial Mexico, that we might find it surprising that this indigenous chronicler named Chimalpain found his life to be satisfying and enriching. But she asks rhetorically whether any of the world's peoples have ever allowed themselves to be flattened by crisis forever. Colonialism, the devastating epidemics, they did indeed result in massive demographic loss. There was indeed, you know, significant impoverishment. But even at the time, people pointed to things they liked. They loved boxes with locks. They loved the colorful silks. They loved the new forms of music that came from Africa and Europe. They loved cow's milk. So I think that the past offers us an infinite number of cases of people rebuilding lives after crisis, which is what we will be doing shortly once COVID no longer poses the threat that it does today. So I think paying attention to the diversity of ways that people have rebuilt, maybe it gives us the opportunity to think about possibilities that we hadn't really seen previously for how to rebuild.
Great, thank you. And if we have time, I do want to get back to the notion of 2020 and how that will be remembered. But let me just turn one more question to you, Professor Banerjee. And within, again, the framework of this conversation and the book you read, The Anarchy, does Western thought and scholarship need to make more space for histories from the global South? And why might it matter for how we view and tackle some of the challenges the world is facing today?
Well, I think one of the crises that runs parallel to the crisis of, shall we say, pandemic, you know, there's one, it's that of environmental degradation, and you can relate that very directly to corporate greed and plunder of largely the global South by peoples of the global North. I mean, that's that's something that these histories illuminate. And it's not, and also shows the complicated and entangled histories of exploitation. So, you know, we're thinking of the 18th century of India as a kind of colonized space where the British East India Company is indulging in loot and plunder. And right now, Indian companies are going to Australia and setting up coal mines in First Nation lands of Australia. So you have a post-colony, which is also now functioning in some parts of the world as a neo-colony. So, you know, so there is a certain kind of reproduction, if you will, of a certain logic of expropriation that one sees in the East India Company now taking place in a very different way, articulated in a very different way, in, again, an entirely different space, Australia. So one of the things that histories from histories of the global South, histories of Africa, Caribbean, you know, Latin America, what this allows us to see is the way this our world has really interacted and produced the world that we live in. the peoples of the world have interacted and produced the world that we live in. So you used the term distant histories a little while ago. And one of the things that we need to see is that, yes, these are distant histories, but these are also histories that shape histories of home. So in some ways, that the fact that these histories can be disentangled, but they also are at some fundamental level deeply imbricated and entangled. And that's what gives us a sense of our present. So the past is not just simply about the past, but the past kind of retains a presence and a structuring force in the present. To use the word present twice. So I think that's what histories such as this allow us to see. This is what illuminates.
Great. Well, I think that's a great segue into, I guess, the last question or theme which I want to put out. We only have a few minutes left, but before we close, I'd love to get each of your thoughts on how the year 2020 might be perceived by historians and scholars, well into the future and everything that we're dealing with now. And I guess my question, I'll start with you, Professor Adjetey, if that's okay, is there any one aspect of life in 2020 that we may not be appreciating here in the moment that will come under greater scrutiny with the passage of time and hindsight? I mean, will historians really puzzle over why Professor Lisa Overholzer was vacuuming her home every single night for 6 months?
Thanks, Derek. It's certainly hard to predict and anticipate what future scholars might make of our futile rebellions today, very real rebellions today, and our various idiosyncrasies, right? But what I can say is that in 1919, for example, right, circa 1919, 1920, with the tercentennial, the 300th year anniversary of the arrival of African captives on the North American mainland, which would become the United States. African Americans marked that occasion. They not celebrated, but they marked that occasion to remind other Black folk of what they have endured for 300 years. And certainly they expressed their, innermost yearnings of something better for posterity. And here we are, right, a century later. And some might say that somehow, things have improved. Well, look, there was a Black president. Look, there's a VP elect who has some Black African ancestry. But for the vast majority of African Americans, the vast majority of those whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States, they will likely be asking similar questions as their forebears did in 1919, a century from now, right? When will we achieve self-determination? When will we taste the fruits of liberation, right? And certainly, I presume historians then might also ponder, well, why is it that certain things have not changed where the empire is concerned? And even as Professor Banerjee so eloquently put it, why does the continual plunder of the quote unquote global South? And this plunder certainly is evolving in other ways that is implicating members of the global South. Why does this continue to happen? And certainly, I don't think we can have this conversation without understanding stratification, especially class, and how sort of a global ruling elite continues to subjugate those who are voiceless, those who are most vulnerable.
But let me ask you this follow-up question. I'll ask you just to be brief because I do want to give time to other professors. But George Floyd, that was obviously a seminal moment of the year of 2020. Does George Floyd become like the next Rosa Parks in terms of that one figure that we all sort of remember that maybe did, lead, and Rosa Parks certainly led to, the beginning of perhaps the desegregation movement? I mean, does George Floyd and his tragic passing, in fact, be the kind of moment that historians look back on 50 years from now?
Without a doubt, Derek, this is a watershed moment. George Floyd's execution was a watershed moment. However, it's not going to be the type of catalyst that the most marginal group of African Americans desire, because the movement has already been co-opted before it even began, right? We have, on a regular basis, various publications, corporate media, publishing works stating that since George Floyd's execution, X number of Black people have been tapped for board appointments. That's not what the movement was about. Somebody like me does not need to be tapped to serve on some privileged corporate board. But I do want my brothers and sisters who are still living in the slums to eat and be secure in their person. And that's not where the attention is. And so, unfortunately, George Floyd is a martyr, but not a martyr whose death will shed sort of light on the plight of his peoples.
Great, thank you. Professor Overholtzer, so putting your vacuum cleaner aside, is there a moment, so where do you think sort of anthropologists and archaeologists, I mean, when, years from now, obviously we're talking archaeology, when they look back on what the world went through in this moment, 2020, and all the issues, what do you think, will stand out for them?
Yeah, I think my mind goes first to my students, undergraduate and graduate, who essentially, it's sort of trite, but are the future. And I look to their perspective and what they think, to what they're saying to me today. And, we've recently restarted this process of examining, say, academia and archaeology, and who is in it, and who is represented by its practitioners. And for example, there have been some surveys of faculty that show that, there's been significant improvements in gender equity, in the professoriate, but we're still only at 32% women in the professoriate in Canada in the discipline of archaeology. There was a demographic survey recently of archaeologists across Canada in both the public and private sector, sort of in academia and working professionally, and 0.0% of archaeologists were Black. The survey found not a single Black archaeologist. And I think that my students would say, and they are saying, how is that this is 2020 and this is where we are, right? We should be better than this by now in terms of equity. This is appalling. So I think that I don't think history is going to look back particularly kindly on 2020, I would say, in terms of, archaeology and academia more broadly.
You're probably right about that. Professor Banerjee, we only have a couple of minutes, so maybe I'll give the final word to you. And I should mention, I don't think I did earlier, you're actually joining us today from Calcutta, India. So I think you're seeing the pandemic and all of these other issues from maybe a different vantage point than we are here in North America. Where do you think 2020 will fall in the annals of global history?
I think both the other panelists raised very important points, and I think I just want to add that we need a certain very definite structural analysis of our lives. We need to have a sense of why things have gone or have become the way they are, but structurally, not just thinking about, for instance, you mentioned George Floyd, one George Floyd or the pandemic response in one country, but structurally, why is it possible for people to be the way they are in, or what forces, I should say, what structures people to react or respond the way they do in our current moment. In 2020, we're seeing the pandemic. We're also seeing a large number of people saying we don't need to wear masks because we have lungs and all those kinds of things. And that seems pretty logical in some ways. But you also see at the same time stories of great resilience. So, I mean, Professor Adjetey's point, I think, is a very important one about the co-optation of the movement. But you also saw people actually stepping out at great personal risk to protest the system. We've seen this in India last year with the government changing certain citizenship laws, people coming out again at great personal risk to their lives and livelihoods, and sort of pushing back against these structures, if you will. So a structural analysis is, I think, what is imperative to understand the way these lives, these questions of equity, these questions of deaths, how these come about.
Great. Well, thank you all for those wonderful closing remarks and reflections on the year 2020. That does about wrap up the time we have today. Before we close, I would like to remind everyone that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share with others who may not have been able to tune in live. I would, of course, like to extend my deepest gratitude to our three guests today, Professors Wendell Adjetey, Sandeep Banerjee, and Lisa Overholzer, for joining us and sharing incredible insight and analysis, not just on the three Cundill Prize finalists and the books, but in the important role that history and other disciplines can play in our current lives. If you would like more information about the Cundill Prize and the announcement of the winner, which will take place at a virtual ceremony on December 3rd, please visit cundillprize.com. That's CUNDILL prize.com. Finally, I'd like to take a quick moment to recognize a few people. Today's webcast would not have been possible without the support of Antonio Maioni, Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at McGill, and Mackenzie Blejo, Cundill History Prize Coordinator. Today also marks the 29th alumni webcast we've hosted since the middle of March, and I owe a debt of gratitude to Stuart McCombie and Jonathan Roy from McGill's multimedia team for pushing all the right buttons to keep us on the air. And of course, to my dear colleague, Taylor Valet, who has worked so hard behind the scenes, helping me sort out topics and guests, promoting these webcasts to the public, and assuring me that all would be okay on those occasions when the lights were flickering and we thought we might lose power or Wi-Fi, which thankfully has never happened. And thank you, of course, to our wonderful McGill alumni, those of you down the street and those of you on the other side of the world, for tuning in as often as you have. Please keep watching your McGill emails for more exciting programming. And as always, stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Born from a will, made here by dreamers and risk takers, by makers and big thinkers. Through trial and error, we face what's ahead, staying true to the voice that never fails us. Keep learning. We were made for this. Made by lamplight and late nights, by salut and goodbyes, by questioning everything and feeding our curiosity, by testing our resilience, by finding our limits. By pushing forward and by breaking through, by finding a new way, our own way. We're made where ideas are built and built upon, where we come together and we rise above. We are made by McGill.